Hello, and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast number 2067. The topic is nutrition, and the title is Carb Management for Peak Performance and Body Fat Control. One of my clients is a personal trainer. Actually, over half of my clients are personal trainers, but this one is a business client, so we're working on developing his business services. One of the services he's been offering now is nutrition programming. So we're talking about all that entails, and he's asking general questions. One of the recent questions he asked was, how many carbs can you have in a day without gaining body fat? And he purposely made it, he said, pretty general, because that's kind of the questions he gets are very general. So he wanted to know how I would answer that question. So I decided to expand. I gave him a shorter answer that he would be able to say to a client in, say, 10, 20 seconds. But I wanted to give a longer answer in today's podcast to help with the understanding of how to approach this question and just the understanding of the answer, why the answer is what the answer is. So again, the question was, how many carbs can you have in a day without gaining body fat? The general recommendation I'm going to give you calculations and numbers, but it's a general recommendation. You would then track your body weight, your body composition, performance, and recovery capacity, and then see how you feel from there. Meaning, if we start with these calculations and all of a sudden your body weight goes up 2 pounds the first week, but you feel full and you look good, feeling full, muscular, your muscles are full. It feels like, I just kind of feel like I got to pump all the time. Feeling pretty full, feeling pretty good, feeling strong in my workouts, feeling really good. I would go ahead and just let that happen because you might find the body weight increase is only that initial first week. It's an improvement in performance. It's an improvement in aesthetics. You actually look better. You feel better. It's probably just your muscles filling up with carbohydrates. Now, let's say, for example, your weight went up 4 pounds the first week. You felt watery, flat, extra water retention around your midsection, and you kind of felt lethargic and blah in your training, then something's off. Now, typically what happens usually, if that's the response, the person has been chronically under-eating, and the adjustment they made was too many calories too quickly, so they need to kind of take a step back and titrate that up slower over time. So there are going to be individual responses to what I'm about to give you, but I want to give you the numbers so that we have a general ballpark of where to start from. If a person is training 4 times a week or more, I usually use their body weight times 15, and that's their total calories. Now, I will use a lean body weight. So if they're 250, but we both know, me and the person know, they'd probably be healthy and look good at 200, I'm going to use 200, not 250 as my number. Now, let's say, lady, she's 165 pounds. She feels relatively confident with the way she looks. She would just like to lose a little bit of body fat, but she's 165 pounds. She's not really desiring to be down to 130. She just wants to be a little bit better looking. Then I'll usually use right around 165. So it's kind of a ballpark. You're going to guesstimate, okay, if they were at a healthy, good body fat percentage that they would be able to keep all year round, what number would that be? What I don't want to use is if they're 30+% body fat, I don't want to use their actual body weight because you're now accounting for calories for body fat that isn't metabolically active, so you don't need that many calories. Or I wouldn't want to say, if they're 3% body fat and peeled and super shredded, they would weigh this. Somebody use that number. No. A good number is just a good, healthy, general, lean body weight. Probably somewhere they would be, say, ballparking again, between 10 to 20% body fat. 10 is actually very lean, but sometimes people are just naturally that lean. 20% body fat, if somebody's over that, I probably wouldn't want to use their actual body weight. I would guesstimate what they might weigh at, say, 20% and use that number. But this gives you an idea. It just gives you somewhere to start. So if they train 4 times a week or more, body weight times 15 is total calories. If they train less than that, Now, again, the idea here is that they're at least training. So carb management for peak performance means there's something you're performing. So we wouldn't want to think of it as, if we think of somebody training 4 times or more, or somebody training, say, 2 or 3 times, you might say, well, what about somebody who doesn't train? We're not even going to talk about that because that's not good. That's a different conversation in the sense to where they wouldn't need to be doing what we're going to talk about the entire rest of the podcast about timing their carbohydrates and whatnot, because there's nothing to time it around. So we're specifically going to be looking at just people who train 4 times or more, body weight times 15, like less than 4 times, but they still training, is body weight times 14. So that gives you a general idea. Now again, that would all be individual basis. If I have somebody who's coming to me now and they're over dieted, they've just tried every diet under the sun, they're struggling to stay lean, they gain body weight just looking at stuff, and their average calorie intake right now is body weight times 10, I will not just bump them to times 14. I would say, okay, if you're body weight times 10, let's normalize that. Make sure we're there, plus or minus 10% all the time. Once we can be consistent with that for, say, at least 10 out of 14 days, I then might go to body weight times 11, do that for 10 out of 14 days, body weight times 12, 10 out of 14. And what I mean by 10 out of 14 is if we aim for, say, body weight times 12, and they only hit that 5 days out of 2 weeks, I'm not going to adjust the number. I'm going to wait for them to be more accurate within that number. I have clients all the time, unfortunately, whenever we're doing like non-competitive clients that are training recreationally, they're going to often be maybe 50% adherent to a diet. And that's a bummer because they're not happy. They're not getting the results they want. But they just need to tighten up things. They need to tighten up shit. You need to make a little more strict choices. You need to plan ahead a little more. You need to kind of give a shit a little bit more in regards to your attention to it versus your actions to it. There's a lot of times there's a large difference between attention versus action, meaning somebody feels they're attentive to their diet. Like, oh yeah, I missed today. I was rushed for breakfast. I didn't have the right foods at lunch. Then I finally felt like overwhelmed. I was super hungry at dinner. So they were attentive to the diet all day, but they didn't act in any way towards adhering to it. So when somebody's less than 10 out of 14 days being consistent with their numbers, you're going to be looking at adherence components, like adherence issues, not actually adjusting numbers. So I would say, okay, hey, do we have a good couple options per meal that we know we can shop ahead of time, buy it, have it in the house, grab and go when we need? If we often eat out, where do you often eat out at? What are some good meal choices you have at each location? So we would game plan this, and then I would also ask them, how high of a priority are you putting this in your life? Like, what are you doing instead of food prepping? What are you doing instead of buying the right foods? What are you doing instead of eating a meal when you know you should, but you don't, you skip it because of XYZ? What is XYZ? What is getting in the way? What are you allowing to be more important than your nutrition? So we would unpack a lot of stuff, but I wanted to throw the numbers out there so that way people have somewhere to start, or kind of a mental game plan, something they can use. Now, out of our total calories, somewhere between 25 to 33% we want to be protein. There's going to be an enormous variance in there, but that's a general good ballpark area to be in. Eventually, I do work people up if their goal is, if they train at least three hard times a week or more, I want to work them up to about 1 gram per pound of body weight. Sometimes 0.8 grams per pound of body weight is fine. They'll look good, respond well. But typically, if somebody's being meticulous enough to pay attention to carb management, they're probably training pretty consistently and pretty aggressively, pretty intensely. So we can probably afford to bump the protein up to 1 gram per pound of body weight. What we do once we're at 1 gram per pound of body weight, if their body can tolerate more calories, then we add carbs and fats, not more protein. So once I get somebody to 1 gram per pound of body weight, I very rarely do I increase protein. I will in some cases, very large bodybuilding clients, we will go ahead and consume more. But for most people, they're not going to really need more than that. So if we increase calories beyond that, we typically increase in carbs and fats, like energy-based calories. And that could be because they're just crazy busy on their feet. I remember I had a client I was working with one time. He was an apple farmer, and he was consuming his body weight times 20 in calories. Body weight times 20. And he was shredded, six-pack abs all the time. If he ever went under body weight times 20, he actually started to have water retention around his lower abs and his waistline because he was actually being underfed. So there are cases in which people do need an enormous amount of calories. But when you're at that rate, like that level of calories, we wouldn't want 33% of his diet to be protein because, like his case, he was relatively light. He would have been around 150, maybe 160 pounds. I don't need him eating like 300 grams of protein a day. It's unnecessary. It's not even going to really do anything for him. He's just going to end up going to the bathroom a lot, being overly stuffed, and actually being very low in energy, very high in cortisol, because he probably wouldn't be able to consume enough carbs and fats to maintain the energy demand he needed. He would be using a lot of space in his meals towards protein that his body couldn't even utilize, couldn't even turn into new muscle tissue. So that's what we're looking for, is 25 to 33% of your total calories being protein. Work up to 1 gram per pound of body weight in protein. And then if your calories are above that, you would add carbs and fats, not protein. The lowest I would typically want someone's fats to be is around 10%. When I get into the macronutrient percentages and helping people with specific food choices and whatnot, I'm absolutely okay if fat is above that. No worries. But if we're saying here, and the question is how many carbs can you eat in a day? We want to have at least the protein we need. We want to have at least the fat we need, and then the rest can be carbs. So what is the at least the fat we need? Is roughly 10% of your calories coming from fats. That's a very loose number, and you want to have a mixed source of saturated and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats, they get kind of villainized for heart impact, like heart health impact, but there actually is benefits to saturated fats for hormone health. But fats in general help towards hormone health, vitamin metabolism, cell health, and a bunch of other good things in the body. So we do want to maintain some level of fats in our diet. So the ranges again are 25 to 33% protein, 10% fat, but it can be more than that, meaning that the rest of the calories, up to 65%, can be carbohydrates. And you might find somebody in like extreme cases. I've worked with Olympic qualifying level runners who run 1 mile in longer type runs. So 1 mile is basically a sprint, but they also run longer as well. And their carbs are just absolutely bonkers, crazy high. One of the clients ate a box of Frosted Flakes before he would run. So think of the carb content of an entire box of Frosted Flakes, and that's what he would have. Otherwise, he'd lose weight, and it was pretty crazy. So there are extreme cases where these percentages can be different, but again, this gives you some general ideas to go with if you want to track these kind of numbers. Now, the carbs, if you're following the protein percentage, the fat percentage, you're following your total calorie count, the carbs that you consume will be burned off for energy. They will not be converted to body fat. Now, you might have to fine-tune the calories a little bit, over the first couple weeks, but as the calories become correct for your activity level, your body weight, you won't gain body fat by eating carbohydrates. The simple act of eating a carbohydrate does not mean you will gain fat. It is astounding, astonishing, saddening that is sometimes what people think, is that carbs make you fat. No. Excessive carbohydrates can make you fat. Excessive fats can make you fat. Excessive calories in general, whether that comes from a mixture of carbs and fats, can make you fat. So carbohydrates do not make you fat. Now, you can experience body weight fluctuations when your carb intake fluctuates. Meaning, if you have really high carb intake one day, very low carb intake the next day, you'll see a weight loss on that second day. Vice versa, if you eat a low carb intake one day, you do a high carb intake the next day, you might see a weight gain. That is water difference. That's water retention difference, not body fat difference. When we consume carbohydrates, it pairs together with glucose and water, and it forms a substance called glycogen in our muscles. Glycogen is basically an energy, just an energy source, energy material that our body will break down within the muscles and use as like an initial source of energy when it needs it. So think of it as gasoline in a gas tank. Your body just puts the gas tanks in the muscles. So rather than having one centralized gas tank, all of our muscles have the possibility to hold some gas, hold some energy. And when we consume carbohydrates, it pairs with sodium and water, and it creates that energy for us, that stored energy. Now, when we have more carbs or less carbs, we'll have more water or less water being stored in our muscles. And then that is what is related to the change in body weight. When we have less carbohydrates, we have less water in our muscles, therefore we weigh less. When we have more carbohydrates, we have more water in our muscles, therefore we weigh more. So the weight variance that we have like from day to day from carbohydrate intake is water retention difference, not body fat formation or body fat loss difference. If you want to learn more detailed kind of concepts of how much, like basically how long does it take you to gain fat, is podcast 1897. It's titled How Much Fat Do You Gain When You Overeat? You can find that podcast on our website if your podcast player doesn't go back that many episodes. The podcast player on our website goes back 300 episodes. So you can scroll back and find podcast 1897. Now, what I want to look into is we have an idea of the total calories we should have. We have an idea of how many of the, like how much of that calories should be protein, how much should be fat, and how much could be carbohydrates. So we said up to roughly 65% of the calories can be carbohydrates. Now, when do you time that? Like if we talk about carb management, that would refer to timing of those carbohydrates. So if we look at, I want to look at the goals of bodybuilding, which can include anybody in aesthetic sport. So bikini, wellness, figure, women's physique, men's physique, classic physique, bodybuilding. Anybody in those categories. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about strength athletes, such as powerlifting and strongman. We're going to talk about CrossFit and sport athletes and runners. Those are going to be the categories we look at today. I have clients outside of those categories, but that's going to cover probably the majority of everybody listening. So, aesthetic sports, and that's going to be, bodybuilding shows, anybody that compete in a bodybuilding show. Your glycogen control is going to be your main focus. You would like to peak your glycogen leading into the workout, and then you would want to have your glycogen be under its peak level away from the workout. Doesn't have to be zero. Certainly doesn't have to be zero. Probably going to feel like crap if it is. But we don't want it to be maximized. When our glycogen stores are maximized, that means our body really has nowhere to put excessive energy. And then therefore you do start to form body fat. So we would like to have our energy stores full at the time of the workout, but less than full away from the workout. So we reduce body fat formation, body fat storage. So really glycogen control is the main focus for aesthetic athletes. If I'm consuming a meal, say 3 hours or more ahead of my training, I'm going to be looking at complex carbohydrates. They're generally slower digesting than simple carbs, which are typically sugars, and they can often be referred to as starchy carbs. But these slower digesting carb sources, they have a less just a smaller sugar spike basically after consumption, which is good for general health, let alone the taking of any momentary excess and having it converted to body fat is going to be reduced when blood sugar spike is reduced. You're going to also have longer energy sustainable energy after that meal. You're going to feel fuller for longer after that meal. And often starchy carbohydrates or complex carbohydrates, they'll include fiber, which can help with digestive regularity. There's a bajillion of them, but think of like breads, bagels, beans, rice, pasta, potatoes, high carb containing vegetables. There's an enormous amount, but those are what we would look for when we're, say, 3 hours or more ahead of training. Oats. If you're in the aesthetic world, I'm sure somebody has told you to eat oats before. So you don't have to, by the way, but you'll hear that all the time. And then say an hour or less ahead of training, if you want to get some extra carbs in, if that times out well for you and that's a good meal time for you, you find out that when you do that, you have better workout energy. We're typically going to be focusing on simple carbs, which would be liquid sugars. And I usually have my clients use liquids because it helps with hydration. And we often want something that helps to fortify electrolytes. So that way we really have kind of the building blocks of sustainable energy in place. So we have our electrolytes, the things we need for muscular contractions in place, good hydration and good energy via the carbohydrates. So we're going to use Gatorade powder. Sometimes you'll see electrolyte powders like LMNT, like Element powders. Some people use fruit juice. There's a lot of options out there. You'll see sometimes people use gummy bears and things like that, like gummy worms. I'm not a big fan of solid sugars. If I'm going to have a sugar, I want a lot of the other benefits as well. So I would like to have the hydration. I would like to have the electrolytes put into it as well. I want to get more from it than just sugar. So that's my preference. But that's typically what I have my clients do, is if we're going to have some type of fast digesting carbohydrate ahead of the workout, I like liquid because it does help with hydration. And we're going to look at something that has some aspect of electrolyte support into it. But that's going to be what we do leading into the workout, is 3 hours ahead of the workout, complex carbohydrates. 1 hour ahead of training or less, you're going to look at simple carbohydrates. And then post-workout, you're going to do simple carbohydrates again, help get some energy back in the system with some fast-digesting protein. And the reason why is we do want to have protein in our body after a workout, so our body can start protein synthesis, muscle formation, muscle repair, all that good stuff. But it also needs energy to do those elements. It needs those processes. It needs glucose. It needs energy. It needs something to fuel that protein being broken down and allocated and having things done with it. One of the things I did when I was doing my master's in nutrition, I did a big 50-page paper with 200 peer-reviewed research articles on the anabolic window and whether we should have protein only or protein plus carbs post-workout in order to maximize protein synthesis. And the answer is that simple carbohydrates do help. So a lot of research went into that just to have that simple answer. Protein only is great. It does do good things, but when you add simple carbohydrates, you tend to get better rate of protein synthesis. So adding some simple carbs post-workout is a good idea. If that's your goal, is maximal protein synthesis, which if your goal is bodybuilding, it damn sure better be. Then after that window, like say 3 hours or more after the workout, you can still have like complex carbohydrates if you want. You can also do mixed meals with some carbs, some fats, or you can just shift into mostly fats with minimal carbs. That would kind of depend on what you're doing after your workout. If you still have to be active and you find being active with meals of carbohydrates is better for you than meals of fats, meaning if you eat meals of high fat, you have low energy, crappy digestion, you just kind of feel like crap the rest of the day, then switch over to having complex carbohydrates. The other component would be is how big someone is. The more muscle they have, the more glycogen storage capacity they have. They might not be able to go full fats on meals the rest of the day and then still be able to get their glycogen full enough for the next day's workout. So they might need to maintain, say, roughly 50% glycogen levels so that way they can peak that easier the next day for the workout. So it depends on muscle mass. It depends on activity level after the workout. It depends on how a person feels. on high fat versus high carb meals. I have done every diet under the sun. I have done keto, where I did the pea sticks and made sure I was in ketosis and all that fun stuff. I just feel better when I eat carbohydrates. I have better energy. Just everything goes better for me. And I can be leaner. I can be as lean as I could be on any keto diet as I could do with a carb diet. They've done studies and have shown that you can use either style of a diet to get, very lean. There are people who do bodybuilding shows that are, peeled to the bone, and you'll see some people do ketosis, some people do carb-based diets. It's just preferential. But it's finding what works for you and what you prefer, but it is nice to know that you can have carbs and it won't automatically make you fat. Now, if we look at powerlifting and strongmen, typically for this category of people, I tend to encourage, especially my powerlifting clients, to be lean because it helps to maximize their weight class. For strongmen, it's not as much of a concern, but they're still going to be mobile. They're still going to move some things around. All competitions are going to have some kind of medley where you got to move some stuff, including yourself, move you. So making sure that your weight is manageable is helpful. Now, in strongman, you'll see people, look at like Zydrunas Zavickas in his later in his career, big power belly, not very mobile. He was probably crazy mobile for how damn big he was, but relative to the other strongman competitors, wasn't as mobile. But now you start seeing people like Tom Stoltman, Mitchell Hooper, where people are starting to be massive human beings, but they're still actually relatively lean. And that tends to be a good body weight, body composition. So for them, body fat control is still going to be very helpful. In that case, we do the same thing. 3 hours before the workouts, complex carbohydrates. 1 hour or less before the workout, simple carbohydrates. Post-workout, you still want to have simple carbohydrates to help the protein digestion and protein synthesis start kicking off. But then outside of our workout times, we do focus more into fats and more minimal carbohydrates. We're going to start to focus on blood sugar control and trying to bring down the digestion. We want to slow the digestion of the food because that reduces any temporary excess that we might have at the time of consuming the meal. So it decreases any potential rate of fat formation, which then we just have to tear right back out, when we have time between our next meal. But if we can just prevent fat formation in the first place, that would be great. So typically that's what we do for powerlifters and strongmen is carbs leading into the workout and then carbs right after the workout, but then mostly fats the rest of the time. Now, CrossFit athletes, sports athletes, it's going to be similar, but they're going to need way more total carbohydrates. So their total carbohydrate intake is going to be much higher for CrossFit athletes, sport athletes, like pound for pound, comparatively to, say, powerlifting or strongman athletes, simply because they're going to have much more volume in their training. They're going to have a lot more just caloric usage and movement, and that's going to equate to, again, pound for pound, a higher usage of carbohydrates. Now, if you're not looking at pound for pound, you might look at a powerlifter or, say, a strongman. They're like, I had 1,000 grams of carbs a day. And you're like, okay, yeah, but you weigh 400 pounds. So you had, 2.5 times your body weight in carbs. Where you might have a sport athlete, maybe they're only 180, but they're eating 3 to 3.5 times their body weight in carbohydrates. So it would be less in total carbohydrates, but it's actually more in pound for pound. So pound for pound, CrossFit sport athletes, much more carbohydrates. And again, same thing, 3 hours before the workout, complex carbohydrates. As you get closer to the workout, especially under 1 hour, you're going to look at quicker digesting carbohydrates. Post-workout, quick carbs. After that workout, you're going to focus more into fats and moderate to slow carbohydrate intake. And then runners, you get your choice. So you can choose to fuel your running via carbs or fats or any kind of mixture from there. It really depends on preference, food preference, digestibility, and run duration. Some of my clients, they'll do exceptional and do great and be predominantly fat intake. Same exact distances, just a different person. They might be predominantly carbs and feel great and do great. And often we'll have experimented with both, or I know they have experimented with both, and we know that we wound up in the one that is working best for them. We're hitting PRs, they're improving, they're feeling great. So runners, you're going to still keep that same idea of fueling up into the activity and then tapering down away from the activity, whether you fuel up with ketones, whether you fuel up with glucose, whatever it might be, whatever your choice source is. Now, all of these activities can be sustained through a low-carb diet. You can find aesthetic athletes who do low-carb diets. You can find powerlifters and strongmen who do low-carb diets. You can find CrossFitters and sport athletes who do low-carb diets. You can find runners who do low-carb diets. But carbohydrates are a potential fuel source in all of these activities. And typically, people's performance is boosted when they have some degree of glycogen storage that then can be contributed towards energy-wise towards their activity. Now, maybe their activity doesn't technically maximize glycogen, okay, but you're often going to feel better having carbohydrates in your diet. Now, if somebody's in ketosis, they might want to stay in ketosis, not consume the carbohydrates. If their brain has switched over to running on ketones, everything's feeling kind of smooth, you got through that foggy kind of transition, then I probably wouldn't jack that up. I'd stay in where you are ketosis-wise. But if people are wanting to figure out, can they consume carbs? Hell yes. And especially in aesthetic sports or aesthetic component of any sport, is carbs help fill our muscle glycogen, which actually helps kind of fill up the muscles, and the muscles look fuller and tighter against your skin. So that's huge. That can make people feel mentally, emotionally, and motivationally better because they look in the mirror and they're like, damn, I'm looking good, everything's looking tight, feel great. So carbohydrates can have even just an emotional factor, a motivational factor, let alone a performance factor as well. So I have clients who do consume upwards of 50% of their calories from carbs. I have clients who are in ketosis all the time, different stages and seasons. But in order to make sure they're making progress, we do monitor and control their overall calorie intake, protein intake, hydration, and supplementation. So you'll likely find people who can be successful in any of these activities with any diet structure, because all diet structures in some way control calories and protein, which are the two most important components of supportive nutrition, meaning nutrition that supports our performance. The rest of the diet structure is really preferential, whether you're talking about timing of things, exact food choice, whether you do low carb, high carb, low fat, high fat. A lot of those elements are preferential. So if you like carbs, if you want to use carbs in your diet, and if you've been wondering how to do so without gaining body fat, today's podcast was the answer. So fill up your energy reserves leading into training, then pull back on the energy intake post-training, but keep protein relatively consistent throughout the day. And if your total calories per day are controlled, you're going to be pretty good to go. So you absolutely can have carbs and not get fat. What you can find that kind of messes people up is the body weight fluctuation that happens from day to day. People will weigh differently from day to day if their carbohydrate intake is inconsistent. Just remember that isn't indicative of fat gain or loss. Podcast 1897 would have been the podcast that will teach you, how much fat do you gain when you overeat. That would be a good one to check out so that we understand the rate of fat loss, and fat gain, how fast or how slow that actually happens. Awesome. Hopefully this was helpful. I like doing more kind of nuanced topics, but trying to keep them simple and applicable. If you like this type of podcast, let me know. If you have any similar questions that you would like to hear in a future podcast, let me know. The whole idea of the podcast is that it's whatever you want it to be, whatever you need it to be. I want it to be helpful for people. I want it to make a difference in people's lives. So the more I know what you want to know, the more the podcast can do that. You can reach out on our website, www.brutalirongym.com. Scroll to the bottom of the homepage. There's a contact form. You can send me a message anytime. If you like the podcast, please share the podcast. If you like the podcast, please consider donating to support the podcast, which you can do on our website. And if you like the information we share in the podcast, you can find more from us on our social media channels. You can find us and follow us on Instagram and YouTube under the name Brutal Iron Gym. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.